The lake was quiet that morning, just the way I liked it. Sunlight filtered through the early mist, turning the still surface into a sheet of gold. My old aluminum rowboat creaked gently as it shifted against the dock, and the air was thick with the earthy scent of pine needles and summer weeds. I had just cast my line for the second time when I heard the sound heels clacking fast and sharp on the gravel path that wound down toward the easement. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Karen. I closed my eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly, letting the old rhythm of the water settle my breath. It had taken years to find peace like this. A long life of hard work, of sacrifice and grief had led me to these mornings by the lake. This spot had once been nothing but swamp and brambles when my late wife and I first came across it in the late 70s. Back then it was just a scrap of land, with a legal technicality, a recorded easement that let us walk the 50 yards across what later became HOA-managed property down to the water's edge. I turned slowly, resting my hand on the wooden oar. She was already halfway down the hill, dressed in her usual HOA red windbreaker clipboard, in hand, mouth pursed in that way that suggested righteousness, just waiting to be unleashed. "Mr. Alden," she barked before she was even within 10 feet, "I've told you before, this is not your property. You are trespassing." I stayed seated on the dock, my fishing rod resting gently against my knee. "Morning, Karen," I said, not looking away from the bobber floating in the water. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She stopped short, taken aback by the calm. It always made her angrier when I didn't engage. "You can't just sit here like this," she snapped. "This area is for HOA-approved activities only. Fishing is not permitted unless you are a dues-paying resident." I finally turned to look at her, squinting slightly against the sun rising behind her head. "I've been fishing here since before the HOA existed," I said simply, "and I have the paperwork to prove it." "That easement you keep talking about?" She scoffed, making air quotes as invalid. "It predates the rezoning and the community association charter. That means nothing now. The board has ruled." "The board doesn't own this shoreline," I cut in gently. "And that path you paved, it's still part of the easement I was granted in 1978. Her lips thinned. I could see her fighting to hold back a response that would have sounded too emotional, too loud. She looked down at her clipboard, flipping through several pages like they held absolute power. "I'm calling the sheriff," she said, her voice colder now. "This is your final warning. You are violating community rules." I nodded, slow and unbothered. "You go ahead." She hesitated for a beat, maybe expecting me to panic, to pack up my tackle box and shuffle away in embarrassment. But I just turned back toward the water, gave my line a slight tug, and watched the ripples carry out like tiny waves on glass. I heard the crunch of gravel as she stormed back up the hill. 10 minutes passed, maybe more. I used the time to breathe, to remember. The first time Evelyn and I came to this lake, we were just kids fresh out of the military. She was 26, I was 28, and we were still carrying the ghosts of too many things we'd seen overseas. The lake, even back then, had this stillness to it, a kind of forgiveness in its silence. That easement we secured through a handshake and a legal clause was more than just access, it was healing. We built our cabin not far from the tree line just beyond the easement boundary, and promised each other we'd grow old fishing here. I never thought I'd still be here alone. A car engine crunched over gravel in the distance. Tires rolled slow, cautious. Then a door shut. 2 sets of footsteps approached. Heavier boots this time. I reeled in my line and set the rod down as 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies stepped into view. One was young, barely older than my grandson. The other was mid-40s, eyes scanning, hand resting lightly on his belt. Karen followed behind them like she was leading a tour, pointing and huffing dramatically. "That's him," she said, gesturing like she was unveiling a criminal. "He's on restricted HOA land. I've issued 3 citations already. He's refused to leave." The younger deputy looked at me uncertain. "Sir, can I ask your name, Alden Turner?" I said, rising to my feet slowly. My knees didn't move like they used to, but I made sure to stand tall. "Do you live nearby?" I nodded toward the pines. "Cabin's about 300 feet through that grove. Been there 42 years. Longer than that house she lives in up the hill," I added. Karen bristled. "Do you have any documents or proof about this easement?" the older officer asked, voice neutral. "Not on me," I said, "but I've got the deed and the original easement paperwork back at the cabin. You're welcome to follow me up and take a look." "Don't let him take you on some goose chase," Karen cut in. "This is HOA property. Look at the sign." She pointed at a new metal sign that had been planted just a few weeks prior. It read, "Private property, HOA residents only. No fishing, no loitering." The younger deputy glanced at his partner. "Technically, if he has valid paperwork," the older one nodded. "Let's take a walk, Mr. Turner." Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. As we walked up the trail, I could feel the tension radiating off her like heat. But I didn't say a word. The only sound was the wind shifting through pine branches overhead and the distant splash of water against the dock. When we reached the cabin, I motioned toward the porch. "Have a seat, officers. This won't take long." Inside, I moved slowly, careful not to disturb the box, where I kept Evelyn's old files, legal stuff letters, newspaper clippings. I opened the manila envelope marked Land Records and pulled out the original easement contract, a signed agreement dated May 12th, 1978, notarized by the county clerk, with a detailed map outlining the permitted access path from the old dirt road to the lake. I handed it to the officers. The older one studied it for a moment, then looked at me. "This is solid." "I figured it was," I said softly. "Mind if we make a copy of this for the records?" "Not at all." Karen hadn't followed us up the trail, probably too afraid of looking wrong on her own turf. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Before the officers left, the younger one turned to me and asked, "Why not just take this to the HOA and settle it?" I smiled faintly. "Some folks don't want peace. They want control. But control doesn't last when it's built on ignorance." By the time the officers left my cabin that morning, the wind had picked up just enough to rustle the tall grass along the fence line. The clouds were light, scattered like old cotton, and everything felt heavy with the aftertaste of confrontation. I watched the patrol car roll slowly back down the gravel drive, knowing full well that this wasn't the end. Not with someone like Karen. I didn't head back to the lake that day. Instead, I sat on the old swing Evelyn had hung from the porch beam nearly 40 years ago and watched the shadows of trees crawl slowly across the dirt. I'd been around long enough to know that truth alone rarely stopped a determined busybody, especially one armed with bylaws and a taste for control. Karen reminded me of a different kind of fight. Not the kind with fists or bullets, but the kind with paper and ego. And those could get just as ugly. The next morning, I returned to the easement with a copy of the easement deed in a plastic folder tucked in my tackle box. I figured it would buy me some peace if the police showed up again. The air was crisp and damp, the kind of morning you could smell before you felt. My old joints didn't care for the weather, but I was stubborn, and this spot was mine. I'd just baited my hook when a car engine roared behind me. I turned around, and sure enough, Karen's SUV barreled down the trail like she was chasing down fugitives. She slammed on the brakes just feet from the edge of the gravel, jumped out, and began waving her phone in the air. "I warned you," she shrieked. "This is your last chance." I said nothing. Just watched her calm and quiet like I had with men much more dangerous than her. She dialed the phone. 911. What is your emergency? Yes, she said loudly. Eyes locked on me like she wanted me to flinch. There's a trespasser on HOA property who refuses to leave. He's armed with fishing equipment and threatening our community peace. I fear for my safety. My eyebrows lifted slightly at the performance. The dispatcher must have said something because Karen paused, then scowled. Yes, there was an incident yesterday. But I'm telling you, he came back and I feel unsafe. She hung up and crossed her arms triumphant. They're on their way, she snapped. And this time you won't be able to charm your way out. I didn't answer, just reeled in my line and stood. About 15 minutes later, a different patrol car pulled up. A new officer stepped out, older than the last eye's sharper stance looser. He looked at me, then at Karen, then back to me. Mr. Turner, is that correct? That's right, I replied. Do you have any documentation on you today? I handed him the folder wordlessly. He flipped through it, nodded slowly, then walked to the front of his cruiser. Karen followed like a dog on a leash, practically barking over his shoulder. That paper's meaningless now, she argued. The HOA was incorporated in 1996, and all land rights transferred. The officer turned to her, holding the folder like a shield. Ma'am, this is a legally binding easement, recorded and active. The HOA cannot revoke or override it. The man has a right to access this area. Karen's face darkened red, blooming from her neck up to her cheeks. I don't believe that. This has to be some kind of forgery. Then take it up in civil court, the officer replied, polite but firm. But until then, I suggest you leave him alone. You're bordering on harassment. She stood, frozen lips trembling. I'd seen that look before, not just frustration, but the realization that maybe the power she thought she wielded wasn't absolute. That maybe the system she clung to wasn't built just for her. Karen backed up a few steps, opened her car door, and sat down without another word. The officer turned back to me. Would you like to file a report, Mr. Turner? We have documentation of her 911 call and her misrepresentation of your actions. I considered it, but I shook my head. Not yet, I said. Let's see if she learns. He smiled, slightly nodding. Understood. He handed me back the folder and left. Karen didn't follow. She sat in her car for several minutes, just staring at the dock, her grip tight on the steering wheel. Then, without ceremony, she pulled a sharp U-turn and drove away in a flurry of dust. I stood there for a long while, unsure whether I felt victorious or just tired. That night, I received a letter. It wasn't from the city. It wasn't from the sheriff's office. It was from the HOA board, typed on formal stationery with the HOA's seal at the top. The letter read, Dear Mr. Turner, this notice is to inform you that continued use of the common property access trail to the lake violates HOA policy, specifically Articles 12B and 14C, which prohibit non-member use of amenities. As you are not an HOA member, you are hereby ordered to cease usage immediately. Failure to comply will result in monetary fines and potential legal action. Respectfully, Karen L. Barrett, President, Pinebrook Lakeside Homeowners Association. I read it twice, then laughed aloud. They were trying to scare me with policies that had no bearing on the deeded easement. The problem was simple: they didn't understand the land they managed. Or worse, they did, but assumed I wouldn't. That night I pulled out the old county maps, the ones Evelyn had traced by hand, the ones we'd used when petitioning to preserve wetland spaces in the 80s. She had a knack for research, and her meticulous nature, had saved us from more than one land dispute over the decades. I followed her trail again, plat maps, tax records, boundary surveys. And there it was in thick black ink and a red stamp. Easement permanent access. Recorded May 12, 1978. Turner Family Trust. Undeniable. Unshakable. Evelyn would have smiled at that. The next morning I drove to the county recorder's office. It had been years since I'd been inside. The woman at the front desk looked up over her glasses and greeted me like I was an old friend. Within 15 minutes, I had certified copies of the easement deed, recorded maps, and a notarized statement from the zoning board confirming the easement's continued legality. And as I stood there, papers in hand, something in me shifted. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about not being erased. It was about Evelyn. It was about history. When I got home, I scanned the documents into PDFs, printed out 3 new copies, and slipped them into folders. One for me, one for the sheriff's office, and one for Karen. I didn't hand-deliver it. I dropped it in her HOA drop box with a sticky note that read, "Since you enjoy paperwork, here's some bedtime reading. Best. A." Turner, it was petty. I knew that. But it felt good. That evening I sat at the edge of the dock once again. The lake shimmered under the late sun. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and jasmine. And as I cast my line back into the water, I realized something. This battle wasn't just about legal lines on paper. It was about standing in a world that had tried over and over to forget the quiet people, and refusing to disappear. The following week was quiet, but not in a way that brought peace. It was the kind of quiet that hums with tension like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. No more 911 calls, no more red windbreaker marching down the trail, but I could feel Karen circling, like a hawk. I kept fishing. Every morning I took my chair and my thermos down the familiar path, baited my hook, and cast into the calm water. I didn't need to catch anything. The lake had become my declaration, a gentle, stubborn resistance. Most of the time it was just me and the water, but occasionally I noticed more walkers on the trail. Neighbors with leashed dogs. Joggers who nodded silently. Teenagers riding bikes too close to the signs Karen had recently posted. Private property violators will be prosecuted. No trespassing, HOA members only. Fishing strictly prohibited. Funny how none of them used to be there until I made the news. Well, not news exactly, but something close. A local community blog had picked up the story. One of the officers from that second visit must have talked to his cousin, or maybe a neighbor heard about it at the diner. Either way, the post was simple and direct. Local grandpa threatened by HOA for fishing on his own land. Turns out the easement is real, recorded, and over 40 years old. Karen Barrett and the HOA are in hot water. Again. There were comments, plenty of them. Classic HOA nonsense. Let the man fish. Why do HOAs always go after veterans and retirees? Anyone got a copy of the deed? I'd love to see Karen explain this one. It didn't go viral, but it reached our people. My neighbors. The folks who, like me, had seen too many newsletters filled with petty rules and arbitrary fines. People who'd been afraid to speak up or who'd tried and been steamrolled. And it made Karen nervous. I knew it because 3 days later I received a certified letter not from the HOA, but from their legal counsel. RE unauthorized use of HOA managed access path. Dear Mr. Turner, our office represents the Pine Brook Lakeside Homeowners Association. We have been informed of your ongoing use of the lakefront access and wish to clarify the HOA's position. The HOA does not recognize the validity of any easement predating the community charter without explicit reauthorization. You are hereby requested to cease all activities related to lake access until such time that a mutually agreeable settlement is reached. Failure to comply may result in legal proceedings including, but not limited to, injunctive relief. Sincerely, Martin J. Lipkin, Esqueston. Lipkin and More Property Law Group. I read the letter 3 times before setting it down. This wasn't about Karen anymore. This was war. That night I pulled out the original manila folder. Not the copy I'd been carrying to the lake. The original. Thick with decades of records. And as I unfolded the yellowing easement deed once again, I ran my fingers over Evelyn's handwriting in the margins. She'd labeled everything zoning references, map coordinates, cross-references to court rulings. That woman could have out-lawyered any HOA president in the state. I smiled. Then I picked up the phone. My daughter Clara answered on the second ring. "Hi, Dad," she said warmly, but I could hear the edge in her voice, the part that kicked in when something wasn't right. She'd gotten that tone from her mother. "Sweetheart," I said, "I think it's time we look over the easement again." There was a beat of silence. Karen, I confirmed. Another beat. "I'll be there in the morning." Clara was a land use attorney licensed in 2 states with a specialty in property disputes. She'd gone to Berkeley for undergrad, then Georgetown Law. A sharp mind and a sharper tongue when needed. She arrived before noon the next day with a travel mug in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other. We sat at the kitchen table like we had dozens of times before, except now the house felt different, charged, like it remembered Evelyn too. Clara laid out a copy of the easement. "This is airtight," she said after 5 minutes. "It's properly recorded, meets the standard for a dominant tenement easement, and has never been revoked." And they sent a cease and desist letter. I slid it across the table. She read it with a blank face, then raised an eyebrow. "They're bluffing." I thought so. But we can't just ignore it. If they file, we need to be ready to respond. We need to go on the offense, not just play defense. I nodded. "What do you need?" "A copy of the plat map, a zoning confirmation from the county, and..." She paused, flipping through papers. "We need to get a GIS layout of the original easement route. Updated satellite overlay, so they can't claim the access path changed." I leaned back in my chair. "You think they'll try that?" "Oh, they'll try everything," she said. "Karen's probably in a frenzy trying to find a loophole." That night, my grandson Michael emailed me from his apartment in Oregon. "Hey, Grandpa. Mom told me what's going on. I pulled the satellite overlays from the county GIS system and matched them against the 1978 plot. The path hasn't changed. I'm sending you a visual map with boundary lines. Let me know if you need me to testify or anything." Also badass move standing up to Karen. I chuckled. That boy always had a way of mixing tech with charm. The next morning, Clara and I assembled the packet. Everything. The deed, the plat maps, the overlays, the notarized confirmation from the zoning office. We included a timeline of Karen's escalating behavior, complete with photos of the new signs and copies of the 911 transcripts. Then Clara did something I hadn't expected. She printed an official request for HOA board meeting attendance and public record disclosure citing state HOA transparency laws. "They'll have to respond," she said. "And if they don't, we file. I've seen enough bullies in boardrooms to know when it's time to knock." 3 days later, I received a terse email from Karen herself. "Mr. Turner, your request to attend the upcoming HOA board meeting has been noted. We will allow a 5-minute statement at the start of the meeting, limited to matters of personal concern. Please be advised that the HOA reserves the right to restrict disruptive behavior or unauthorized presentations. Sincerely, Karen Barrett, President Pinebrook Lakeside. HOA. Clara read it, laughed, and said, "They're rattled." I looked out at the lake through the kitchen window. The surface was still blue like polished steel. They should be. That weekend, we made copies of the full documentation packet, 5 total, 1 for each HOA board member. Clara printed the easement on thick linen paper, bound the exhibits with tabs, and included a cover letter titled "Formation of Legal Easement Rights and Misuse of Authority." By HOA President. I didn't expect them to read it, but I wanted them to feel it. And so did Evelyn, I imagined. Somewhere. The night before the meeting, I walked down the trail in the dark. No rod this time. No chair. Just me and the lake. I sat at the edge of the dock and dipped my hand into the water, cold and steady. I remembered Evelyn sitting beside me in that same spot 20 years ago during her chemo treatments, when she'd lost her hair, her strength, but never her spirit. She'd always said, "Fight with your head first, then your heart, and never let people rewrite what you bled for." I stood slowly, my knees creaking in protest. The next day would be the first time I'd set foot in a HOA meeting in over a decade. And this time, I wasn't going alone. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a building that tried its best to look stately, with its faux columns and fresh mulch beds, but always felt like it was compensating for something like a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. I hadn't stepped foot in that clubhouse since Evelyn passed. Not because I was afraid, but because I had no reason to. I paid my taxes, tended my land kept to myself, and assumed the board would do the same. But that assumption had rotted with time, and now the place smelled of over-air-conditioned ego. Clara parked the car out front and turned off the engine. She looked over at me, offering a brief smile. "You ready?" I adjusted my hat and nodded. Let's remind them who this land really belongs to. Inside, the room buzzed with small talk. Folding chairs arranged in rows faced a long table at the front, where Karen sat in the center, flanked by 4 board members. She wore her signature red windbreaker, and her lips were pursed tight enough to snap a pencil. Whispers followed us as we walked in, Clara in a charcoal pantsuit, briefcase in hand, and me in a denim shirt tucked into clean slacks. I didn't bother with a tie. I wanted them to see a man, not a performance. Karen's eyes locked on mine as we approached. She offered a brittle smile. "Mr. Turner, we appreciate your interest in board matters. Please remember you've been allotted 5 minutes." Clara stepped forward before I could reply. "Mr. Turner will speak, but as his legal counsel, I've submitted documentation ahead of this meeting. We expect a formal response to the record as required under HOA Transparency Law Section 3.4. Karen blinked. The man seated beside her, Mr. Haskins. I remembered him, cleared his throat, and leaned into the microphone. "Let's maintain decorum. We'll allow the presentation during the open forum section." I nodded and took a seat in the front row. Clara remained standing, flipping open the binder with practiced ease. The meeting droned on for 20 minutes, budget approvals, landscaping disputes, the debate over changing the mailbox color palette. I watched the room, not the board. There were people here who'd lived in Pinebrook as long as I had. Some nodded at me, hesitant but supportive. Others avoided eye contact. Finally, Karen tapped her pen twice against the microphone. "Now for the open forum portion. Mr. Turner, your 5 minutes begin now." I stood slowly and walked toward the front. "My name is Alden Turner," I began. "Most of you know me, or at least know of me. I've lived on the ridge just north of the creek since 1980. And since that time, I've walked the same path to the same lake through a legally recorded easement granted to me and my late wife in 1978. I paused, placing a hand on the table. That easement was recorded before any of your homes existed, before the HOA was formed. It's legal, it's binding, and it's part of the county record. Karen leaned toward the mic. Mr. Turner, we've already communicated through legal channels, Clara cut in without raising her voice. And you've misrepresented your authority. She stepped forward, placing a copy of the packet on the table in front of each board member. These documents include the original notarized easement deed supporting plat maps, satellite overlays confirming the path's integrity, and a notarized letter from the county zoning office. You are not only violating Mr. Turner's rights, you are exposing this HOA to legal liability for harassment and defamation. A murmur rolled through the room. Karen flushed. This is highly irregular, no, Clara said calmly. What's irregular is threatening an elderly man with police intervention for exercising legal access to land he has held for decades. One of the board members, a younger man with neatly parted hair and anxious eyes, flipped through the packet. This easement is... It's legit, he said half to himself. Another woman on the board spoke up. Why weren't we shown this before Karen snapped her binder shut? Because it's irrelevant to HOA governance. This easement doesn't fall under our jurisdiction. It's historical. Outdated. Exactly, Clara replied. You have no jurisdiction. Yet you posted signs called the police issued threats and attempted to criminalize a legal right. Karen looked rattled. For the first time, I saw a hairline fracture in her mask. She shifted in her chair, fingers twitching at the hem of her sleeve. We'll take this under review, she said, barely audible. Clara nodded. You have 1 week to issue a written retraction and formal apology. Otherwise, we'll move forward with legal proceedings. I turned to the audience. I didn't come here to sue anybody, I said, letting my voice carry. I came here because I've spent over 40 years walking that trail to the water. That lake holds memories of my wife, my son, my granddaughter's first fish. This isn't about rules. This is about remembering who we are, about standing our ground with dignity. The room was still. Then someone clapped. Just one at first. Then another. A ripple. Karen sat motionless, eyes fixed on the table. The next day, Clara received an email from the HOA's legal counsel. Resolution offer. The Pinebrook HOA acknowledges the validity of the Turner easement and will cease all attempts to regulate Mr. Turner's access to the lake. We regret any distress caused and will be issuing a formal apology. I stared at the screen in silence. It felt good, not triumphant, just right. Later that evening, I walked the trail again, this time with Clara. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and wet earth. Birds called from the trees above, and the water shimmered as if it had been waiting for us. She stopped at the edge of the dock. You did it, Dad. No, I said. We did. She looked down at the old wooden boards beneath our feet. Mom would be proud. I nodded, throat tight. She's here. In all of it. Karen didn't step down immediately. She waited until the next board meeting, where she announced she was taking time to focus on personal matters. No one argued. The signs came down a few days later. The trail was quiet again. The lake returned to its hush. And I returned to the water rod and hand thermos by my side, ready to fish, to remember, and to reclaim the kind of peace that's earned, not given. The days after the HOA's concession felt strangely still. Not the anxious kind of stillness like before a storm, but the calm after one. The kind that leaves everything a little damp, a little bent. but still standing. I resumed my daily walks to the lake. No signs barred my way. No calls interrupted the silence. And for a time it seemed like Pinebrook was willing to let this dust settle. But I knew better. Karen may have backed down publicly, but I'd lived long enough to know that pride doesn't retreat, it festers. And sure enough, on a Wednesday morning just before sunrise, I found a fresh chain stretched across the entrance to the access path. No sign this time, just a cheap padlock clipped to both ends, and a note duct-taped to the middle. Under maintenance. No entry until further notice. No name. No HOA letterhead. Just cheap, passive-aggressive pettiness. I stood there, arms crossed, staring at the lock, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not rage. Something older. Resolved. I turned around, walked back up the trail, and dialed Clara. She answered groggily. "Dad." They chained the path. "What padlock?" "No entry sign. Looks like maintenance is the new weapon." She was silent for a second. Then, "All right. Let's escalate." That afternoon, Clara arrived with her laptop and her usual no-nonsense stride. She brought Michael too, my grandson, all grown now, tall like his father, but sharper in the eyes, a GIS analyst who could map a forest blindfolded. They set up at my kitchen table, surrounded by land plats, printed emails, HOA bylaws, and a growing stack of documentation. Michael pulled out his tablet. "I've overlaid the easement on current satellite imagery. Look at this, see that path? It hasn't moved an inch since the 80s, and the chain placed directly on the recorded path." "Intentional obstruction," Clara muttered. "They're testing us again." "Why not just cut it off?" I asked. "It's illegal." She glanced up. "Because they want you to react. They're hoping you'll do something they can paint as aggressive. Then they can spin the narrative, elderly man damages HOA property in fit of rage. Make you the problem again." I sighed. "Then what's the move?" Clara smiled. "We get them on record." 2 days later, Michael returned with a drone. Not the little toy kind, but the kind that logged geolocation data and captured 4K footage with timestamps. He launched it from the ridge above my property, controlling it with fluid, practiced thumbs. The footage swept over the access trail, showing the illegal chain the overgrown brush pushed there recently, and the clear obstruction of the legal path. Clara added the footage to our evidence file. That night, she submitted a formal complaint to the county recorder and zoning department, citing the obstruction of a legal easement and requesting a land use violation investigation. We didn't hear anything for 2 days. Then 3 things happened at once. First, Karen dropped off a letter at my mailbox, unsigned, typed, and folded 3 times, "To whom it may concern." The HOA has received reports of unauthorized aerial surveillance over private HOA property. This is considered a potential privacy violation and may be reported to the local authorities. I handed the letter to Clara. She didn't even blink. Empty threat. The drone flight was over your property. No privacy expectation applies to recorded common land. Second, a county zoning investigator showed up. She was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and respectful. She asked to walk the easement, took photos of the chain and lock, and requested a copy of the original deed. Clara handed it over with a smile. "This obstruction," the investigator said, "is a clear violation. The county will issue a notice of non-compliance." And third, HOA board meeting minutes were leaked. An anonymous email from concerned Pinebrook resident hit Clara's inbox containing a PDF transcript of the most recent internal HOA discussion. Karen. "We can't stop him legally, but we can make it unpleasant. If we say the trail needs maintenance, we don't have to justify closing it. Let him stew. He'll give up eventually." Board member number 2. Won't that be seen as retaliation? Karen, not if we keep it vague. Just enough to discourage him. Clara forwarded the email directly to the county and attached it to a formal request for disciplinary review of the HOA leadership. 2 days later, the chain was gone. Not by force, not by confrontation, by consequence. The county had sent a compliance officer who cited the HOA with an official notice of obstruction, a warning of fines up to $10,000 for interfering with recorded access rights, and an order to cease all harassment related to the easement. And suddenly, just like that, the path was clear again. No signs, no chains, no Karen. That Sunday, Michael walked the trail with me. We stopped at the lake's edge and he looked out across the water. Hard to believe this almost got taken from us. It wasn't just about me, I said quietly. This land, it holds our memories. Your grandma, she poured herself into every tree we planted, every trail we cleared. Michael nodded. She was the reason I studied environmental mapping, you know. I know. We sat on the dock together for a long time. No fishing, just listening. Then he turned to me, his voice quieter. Do you ever feel like the more we fight for something, the more we realize how fragile it is? I considered that. No, I said. Not fragile, just precious. Things only seem fragile when people try to take them. But when you stand your ground, when your family stands with you, suddenly, it's strong again. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake in orange fire, Clara stood by the porch railing, arms crossed, watching the breeze stir the pine tops. They're not done, she said softly. I know, but we're ready now. I smiled. We've always been ready. In the mailbox the next morning, we found an envelope from the HOA. Inside was a printed notice Karen had formally stepped down as president, citing health and personal priorities. No mention of the easement. No mention of me. But the silence was confirmation enough, the kind that tastes like justice. I spent the next few mornings walking the trail just a little slower, not because of my knees, though they'd certainly earned their aches, but because I was listening. Listening to the wind in the trees, to the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, and to something deeper, something older. Memory, maybe. It's strange how memory clings to a place. Every tree along that easement, every bend in the trail, seemed to whisper pieces of my life back to me. And when I reached the lake, when I sat on the dock and looked out at the still water, it wasn't just about the battle with the HOA anymore. It was about Evelyn. It always had been. The first time we stood on this shoreline together, it was spring of 1978. I had just left active duty. The war still lived behind my eyes, flashbulbs of noise and smoke and friends I never got to say goodbye to. Evelyn had been my anchor through all of it. Strong without being hard. Soft without breaking. We found the land by accident. We were driving through the back roads after visiting her sister in town. She spotted a narrow trail that cut through an old fence and told me to stop. I remember laughing, asking if she was about to lead me into someone's backyard. She just smiled and said, "You'll see." At the end of the trail was this lake. Unmarked, quiet, still. Back then it wasn't surrounded by houses or board members or bylaws. Just trees. Marshland. And one hand-painted sign nailed to a crooked post that read, "Private easement. Access granted by landholder consent." The owner was a man named Luther Gray. White beard, worn boots, and eyes that looked like they'd seen too many winters. He lived in a weathered cabin just south of the lake, alone except for a Labrador mix and a habit of drinking sweet tea at 6 in the morning. He didn't trust easily, but Evelyn had a way with people. She could ask you a question and make you feel like you'd been waiting your whole life for someone to ask it. Within a week, Luther had invited us to walk the trail freely, and a month later, we were sitting at the county recorder's office filing paperwork for a permanent easement that granted us access to the water across his land, even if it ever changed hands. That was her idea, of course. Evelyn thought ahead. She always did. We couldn't afford to buy land right on the lake, but we could afford the ridge, a strip of pines and rock just above the tree line where the soil was stubborn, but the view was priceless. We built the cabin ourselves, mostly wood salvaged from demolition jobs I picked up during the off-season. Evelyn planted wildflowers along the path. I hung wind chimes from the porch rafters. That cabin became our everything. Our wedding happened under the oak tree out back with Luther as our witness and the lake as our backdrop. Clara was born there in the middle of a thunderstorm. Evelyn cut the umbilical cord herself. She said she'd never felt more powerful. And when the cancer came years later, we didn't go anywhere. She wanted to stay. I want to hear the frogs at night, she said, and see the lake one more time before the first frost. We did both. I carried her down the Easement trail on the last warm day in September. She was thinner than I ever thought possible, but her smile that day could have split the sky. She wore a blue scarf over her bald head and insisted I bring the old thermos of spiced cider. We sat right here where I'm sitting now and watched the sun set behind the trees. She whispered something I've never forgotten. Don't let this place become a ghost, Alden. Keep it alive. After she passed, I tried. I trimmed the trail, kept the dock in good shape, fished when I could, even if I didn't care much for the catch. I kept the lake alive just like I promised. But the world changed. Pinebrook grew. Luther died. His land got sold, subdivided, and absorbed into the new HOA. New rules, new fences, new faces who saw the woods as liabilities and the lake as leverage. They paved part of the trail, posted signs, forgot everything that had come before. I didn't blame them. Not really. But I did mourn. Because when you lose history, you lose more than facts. You lose stories, roots. You lose Evelyn. Later that week, Clara asked me to sit down with a journalist from the local paper. She said the county was reviewing several HOA disputes after our complaint, and that they were considering spotlighting the story in a broader piece about property rights and community overreach. I didn't like the idea of being in the papers, but I owed it to Evelyn, so I agreed. The journalist, a young woman named Danielle, met me on the porch with a notepad and a steady gaze. She asked good questions, patient ones. What made you fight this, Mr. Turner? I thought for a moment. Then I said, because this place isn't just dirt and water. It's memory. And people like Karen think they can pave over memory if it doesn't fit the rules. But some things matter more than rules. Some things are sacred. She nodded, scribbling. Then she asked, and your wife? You mentioned her in your statement to the board. I smiled. She was the reason I ever found peace, I said. And this lake was the reason she stayed. The article came out 3 days later. The headline read, "The Lake, the Legacy, and the Law One Man's Fight Against HOA Overreach." It included photos me on the dock, Clara holding the easement map, and Michael's drone footage showing the illegal blockade. But more than that, it included Evelyn's story. Our story. The kind of story that doesn't scream but stays. People started reaching out. Strangers, veterans, widows, old neighbors I hadn't heard from in decades. Letters, emails. A couple of pies showed up on my porch without a note. And one morning, a small group of kids came down the trail while I was fishing. They asked if they could sit for a while and just listen. I said yes. and I watched them. Heads bent together, whispering, pointing at birds, skipping stones. It felt like something was healing, not just in me, but in the land. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and opened the leather-bound journal Evelyn had left me. I hadn't touched it in years, not since the funeral. The first page read, "If you're reading this, it means you're still here. Good. Stay. Keep walking the trail. The lake remembers us." And I realized then that this fight, this struggle against signs and chains and shallow authority wasn't a disruption. It was a continuation, a defense of memory, a love letter made legal. By the time the next HOA board meeting came around, the air in Pinebrook felt different. People who used to cross the street to avoid conflict now stopped me on the trail to say thank you. Neighbors who'd once been silent at meetings began asking real questions on community forums about budgets, about board elections, about who gave Karen so much unchecked power for so long. What started as a quiet fight for an old easement had begun to crack open something much larger: accountability. Karen might have resigned, but her shadow lingered. And despite the apology letter, there were rumors she was still trying to influence the board from behind the scenes, texting members, stirring old loyalties, pushing to tighten regulations on other properties that had unclear legacy agreements. It wasn't just about me anymore, and Clara knew it. "We need to attend this meeting," she said flatly over breakfast, flipping her legal pad with a sharp flick. "Not just as a family, but as a voice." "What do you mean, voice?" I asked, sipping coffee. "I mean, we put them on record. We present the full sequence of events, the board's complicity, and we ask for oversight. Not just for the past, but for the future." I stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's finish what we started." The clubhouse parking lot was nearly full by the time we arrived. A rare sight. Normally, HOA meetings drew a half-dozen loyalists and one angry guy demanding to know why his mailbox wasn't replaced. But tonight, it buzzed. Someone had printed out copies of the newspaper article and taped them to the door. Another neighbor handed out a stack of petitions calling for term limits and independent audits. Michael was helping a few older residents understand how to scan a QR code on a flyer that read, "Protect our pines. Reclaim our rights." It started with Alden's easement. Where will it end? Inside, the folding chairs were rearranged to face a panel of 5 board members. Karen's seat was empty. In her place sat a man I recognized only vaguely. Roger Pennington, a mild-mannered retired teacher who'd recently been appointed interim president. He looked nervous. Clara, Michael, and I sat in the second row. Roger banged the gavel gently to call the meeting to order. "Thank you, everyone, for being here. We have a full agenda tonight, including multiple open forum speakers and an ethics complaint filed formally against the previous administration." There were murmurs across the room. Then, as part of the scheduled agenda, Roger said, "We'll now hear from Mr. Turner regarding the recent easement dispute and subsequent HOA actions." I stood, handed my folder to the board, and walked to the front with slow, even steps. Some of you know me. Some of you know only the version Karen told you about. I began scanning the room. I've lived in Pinebrook longer than most homes here have had roofs. I came here with my wife in the spring of '78. We were newly married, carrying more scars than we let on, and we found this land when it was just pine and soil and silence. I placed a hand on the easement map. We legally recorded this path, this trail, this connection to the water, and I walked it every week for 4 decades without disruption until this year, when one board member's vendetta attempted to rewrite not only the law, but history. I let the words sink in. Behind me, someone clapped softly, then stopped. I'm not here to gloat. I'm here to remind you that governance without memory is tyranny, and that paper rules mean nothing if they erase human ones. Clara stepped up next to me. She handed each board member a document labeled Formal Request for Policy Amendment and HOA Oversight Committee Proposal. She said, "This proposal includes two requests. First, a board resolution recognizing the Turner Easement and all historical easements recorded before Pine Brook's incorporation. Second, a vote to establish an independent oversight committee made up of residents to review HOA practices, complaints, and potential misuse of authority." A woman in the back stood and asked, "And what happens if the board refuses?" Clara didn't miss a beat. "Then we file with the county initiate recall petitions and pursue civil litigation for every resident who's been silenced or fined unfairly." A hush spread. Then Michael stood and added, "We've already collected 73 signatures in support. That's over 30% of Pine Brook households. This is bigger than us." Roger cleared his throat, clearly overwhelmed. We will take these items under serious consideration. There will be a vote scheduled for next month's meeting." "No," said a voice from the back. It was Mr. Haskins, board member, longtime Karen loyalist. "Why wait? Let's vote now. The community's here. They deserve to see us act." A wave of murmurs turned into a chorus of agreement. Roger glanced around. "All right. If there's a motion to vote, I motion," said Haskins. "Seconded," said another board member. Hands went up. 5 out of 5. Unanimous. The next 10 minutes were a blur. The board passed the resolution. The oversight committee was formed. Clara was nominated unanimously to chair it. And the easement, they didn't just acknowledge it. They placed a bronze plaque at the start of the trail 2 weeks later. Turner Easement Trailhead, established 1978, preserved in honor of Evelyn and Alden Turner, because some paths should never be forgotten. That night, we sat on the porch again. Clara had her feet tucked under her sipping tea. Michael leaned against the railing, scrolling through social media comments under the article about the vote. I sat in my usual chair, listening, not just to the wind, but to something deeper, something like peace. And when I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear Evelyn's voice, light, teasing, gentle as a breath. "You kept it alive, Alden. You kept your promise." I smiled, not because I'd won, but because the land had spoken. And finally it had been heard. 3 weeks after the vote, I received a formal letter from the HOA's legal counsel. But this one was different. It wasn't threatening or evasive or loaded with passive-aggressive phrases like pending compliance or remedy via arbitration. It was respectful. Dear Mr. Turner, the HOA Board of Pine Brook Lakeside formally acknowledges the validity and permanence of the Turner easement effective since May 12, 1978. We deeply regret the distress and disruption caused to you and your family. As a community, we failed to honor not only the law, but the spirit of inclusion and neighborly respect. In addition to removing all signage and barriers, the board has voted unanimously to refrain from any future regulation of your access rights and to educate incoming board members on legacy land designations. Please accept our apologies and know that your voice and your history have helped us all do better. Sincerely, Roger Pennington, Interim HOA President. It was quite frankly stunning, and if the letter had ended there, I might have thought that was the final word. But it didn't. Because 2 days later, I received a call from Danielle, the journalist who'd first written about the case. "Alden," she said, her voice excited, I hope you're sitting down. I'm always sitting down lately, I replied dryly. She laughed. Well, you might want to sit up straight. The story's going national. What HOA Overreach Meets Veterans Legacy, a feature spot on a weekend segment. They're calling it a quiet revolution in suburban law. You Clara the Lake, it's all going to air on public radio next Sunday. I leaned back, stunned. You're serious? I'm serious. Your story's resonating, especially with people who've been bullied by boards, manipulated by rules they didn't vote for. You struck a nerve. That weekend, the phone calls started. A man in Arizona who had his solar panels removed by his HOA and was now fighting to reinstall them legally. A widow in Georgia whose late husband had planted fruit trees decades ago, now being told they were aesthetic violations. A couple in Texas, veterans themselves, who had received daily fines because their fence was painted one shade too dark. And they all said the same thing I read about you, Mr. Turner. You gave me courage. Thank you for standing your ground. Michael helped me set up a simple email account. Within days, it had over 200 messages. Clara read every one. We took turns replying, even hosted a virtual Q+A through the library's community outreach group. That's when something bigger started to form. Not a rebellion, but a reckoning. People began organizing. Small groups, support circles, neighborhood watch alliances, not to watch each other, but to watch the boards. Clara helped draft a template complaint form people could file with their county if they suspected their HOA was overstepping legal bounds. She offered to consult pro bono for 10 cases and ended up taking 30. Michael built a website called Easement Justice where people could upload their property maps, get resources, and read stories like mine. Within a month, a city council member reached out and asked if I'd testify at a public hearing on HOA reform. I said yes. The day of the hearing, I wore the same denim shirt I'd worn to the first board meeting. Clara stood beside me in a navy suit. Michael had flown in and sat near the back recording. I stood before the microphone and told them what I'd told Karen. This isn't just about a dock or a trail. This is about how silence becomes permission. About how we allow people to lose access to what's rightfully theirs, not because it's legal, but because it's easy. I paused, looked out at the room. It took a lifetime to build that easement. It took 5 minutes to ignore it. But it took my family, my community, and our voices to reclaim it. Applause. And this time it didn't feel like noise. It felt like a response. That night, Clara brought out a bottle of bourbon Evelyn had tucked away years ago. We toasted on the porch, just the three of us. To old land, she said, raising her glass. To old love, I replied. Michael smiled. To what lasts? The next morning, something curious happened. A small boy, no older than 10, knocked on my cabin door. He held a folded piece of construction paper in one hand and a tackle box in the other. Are you Mr. Turner? He asked shyly. I nodded. He handed me the paper. Inside, in wobbly crayon, thank you for the trail. My grandpa says you fought like a mountain. Can you teach me to fish? His name was Nathan. We went to the dock that afternoon, and when he caught his first sunfish, he looked up at me, eyes wide with joy. Do you think it remembers me? He asked, holding the fish gently before releasing it. The lake, I asked. He nodded. I looked out at the water, the way the ripples widened from where the fish had vanished, and said, I think it remembers all of us. That evening, I sat alone at the edge of the dock. The sky burned gold and lavender. The wind whispered through the pines. The lake shimmered. And I could feel Evelyn beside me, not a memory, not a ghost, but a presence. Like she'd always been here. Like she'd never left. I whispered aloud, "They tried, Evie. They really did." And in the hush that followed, I could almost hear her answer. "But you didn't let them win." 2 weeks passed after the hearing, and something in Pinebrook had begun to shift quietly but noticeably. For the first time in years, the HOA bulletin board outside the clubhouse wasn't plastered with citations or new restrictions. Instead, a new section had appeared titled Community Comments and Suggestions. Someone had pinned a photo of the Turner Easement plaque beneath it, and handwritten beneath in blue ink were the words, "This is what home should feel like." Karen, meanwhile, had all but vanished. Her resignation as president had been accepted, but her grip on the neighborhood had taken longer to shake loose. There were whispers that she still lurked behind advisory emails, that she attended meetings as a resident under a pseudonym on Zoom, and that she was privately consulting with other board members in neighboring HOAs. But then came the audit. Triggered not by me, but by the very oversight committee Clara had proposed and now led. They'd started by combing through 3 years of HOA finances, and what they found cracked everything open. Duplicate maintenance charges submitted to the board for projects that were never completed. A $14,000 landscaping contract awarded to a company owned by Karen's cousin. Mysterious legal consultations billed during the months when I was being threatened with enforcement notices, payments that far exceeded any documented casework. Clara brought the findings to Roger, who wasted no time. An emergency meeting was scheduled, and for the first time it was open to the full community. The room was packed. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder in the back, whispering and gasping as Clara laid out the full report. Roger followed, explaining the board's shock, their apology, and their unanimous vote to submit the case to the County Fraud Division. Then something remarkable happened. One by one, residents began to speak not just about Karen, but about all the ways they had been silenced. A mother whose child's wheelchair ramp was flagged as a code violation. A veteran whose flagpole was deemed excessively tall. An elderly couple fined for painting their shutters a shade lighter than regulation green. And finally, a voice from the back spoke with trembling defiance. "She made us feel like we didn't belong. And this isn't just about money. It's about dignity." The room stood in applause. Karen wasn't there. But she heard it. Because the next morning, she sent an email to the entire HOA mailing list. Subject to my neighbors. I see now that I let my desire for order cloud my judgment. What began as an attempt to maintain standards became in hindsight a pattern of control. I acknowledge the harm I've caused. I'm stepping away entirely, not just from the board, but from all HOA activities and correspondence. I leave with regret and hope for your forgiveness. Karen L. Barrett. It was the closest thing to humility anyone had seen from her. But for most, it was too late. Later that week, Roger approached me after I finished a walk with Nathan. "We'd like to offer you a seat," he said. "Seat?" I asked. "On the advisory board. It's not formal governance, but it's a place for community elders, people with history, people with memory. We think Pinebrook needs that." I looked down at the lake. "I'm not much for meetings," I replied. He smiled. "You don't need to be. You've already changed everything." Still, I accepted. Not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to protect what we'd reclaimed. That summer, Pinebrook felt more alive than it had in years. The trail was busier, not overcrowded, just appreciated. Kids walked it with kites in hand. Elderly couples strolled together at dusk. Someone even installed a bench halfway down the path with a plaque that simply read, "In memory of quiet strength." Michael updated the Easement Justice site to include new cases, and Clara's oversight committee became a statewide model. They were invited to speak at 3 law schools, and I heard whispers she might even run for county office. I laughed when she told me that. From HOA warrior to public servant, I teased. Your mother would be proud. Clara just smiled. She'd tell me not to let the bastards wear me down. She would. One afternoon, I found Nathan waiting on my porch again. This time with his grandfather Bill, a man I hadn't seen in years. Turns out Bill had been watching from the sidelines all along. I was scared to speak up, he admitted. Figured they'd come for me next. But you didn't back down, Nathan said proudly, looking at me. You fought like a mountain, I chuckled. Sometimes mountains just stand still long enough for the storm to pass, I said. Other times they lean into the wind. We all walked the trail together that evening. Bill told stories of old Pine Brook before the bylaws, before the gates. Nathan listened wide-eyed, asking questions, chasing frogs in the reeds. And when we reached the dock, I sat beside him again, our fishing lines cast into the glassy water. He leaned close and whispered, "Do you think I can fight like that one day?" I looked at him, this small boy with sunburned cheeks and a heart already rooted deep in this land. You already are, I said. Back at the cabin, I stood alone for a while. The wind picked up, and the chimes Evelyn had hung decades ago clinked gently in the breeze. I stepped inside and opened the cedar chest at the foot of our bed. Inside was her blue scarf, the one she wore that last day on the dock. I hadn't touched it in years, but now I lifted it carefully and carried it to the porch. I tied it to the post, letting it dance in the wind. And in that moment, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel worn. I felt rooted, like a mountain. The first frost of autumn came quietly brushing the trees in silver and laying a soft chill across the lake. I noticed it in the way the mist lingered longer each morning, in the way the breeze carried the smell of turning leaves instead of summer jasmine. The dock creaked differently under my boots, now older wood against colder air. But inside me something had thawed. For years I had moved through life like a man walking across thin ice, cautious quiet, hoping not to disturb the stillness that Evelyn and I had once built together. But now, after everything, the letters, the locked trail, the courtrooms and crowded meetings, I felt lighter. Not because the weight had gone, but because I'd finally learned how to carry it. The trail remained open. Neighbors still walked it, kids still played at its edge, and every so often someone would stop by the cabin just to say thank you. Not with grand words, just nods, eye contact. That kind of gratitude that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. Nathan came by every Saturday now. He'd bring his notebook full of sketches, fish trees, birds, and 100 questions. What kind of bait works best for bluegill? Why do the cattails grow near the east side and not the west? Do you think Evelyn would have liked me? That last one always caught in my throat. Yes, I said one day, looking out across the ripples. She would have liked you very much. That afternoon, I gave him Evelyn's old field guide, handwritten notes in the margins, pressed leaves still tucked between the pages. When he opened it, his eyes lit up like someone discovering treasure. He didn't say much, but he hugged me tight before heading down the trail. I watched him go, the book cradled in his arms like something sacred. That evening, Clara arrived unexpectedly. She'd brought her daughter, my granddaughter Lily, with her. Tall now, confident, a college freshman studying environmental science just like Michael. She had Evelyn's quiet smile and my stubborn chin. Thought we'd surprise you, Clara said, as she stepped into the cabin. You always do, I replied, pulling them both into an embrace. We spent the evening making stew, flipping through photo albums and sitting by the fireplace as pine logs crackled and the wind hummed against the windows. At one point, Lily stood and walked over to the shelf, picking up the old map of Pine Brook, the one Clara had once traced for a middle school project. She studied it closely, her fingers grazing the red dotted line of the easement. "This line," she said, "it's not just a path, is it?" "No," I replied. "It's a story." The next morning I found her sitting at the dock before sunrise, bundled in a quilt, sketching the horizon as the sky shifted from navy to gold. I brought her a cup of tea. "You've got her eyes," I said softly. "Mom's, no." I smiled. "Your grandmother's. Eyes that see what most people miss." She glanced down at the water. "Mom told me everything. About the fight, the easement, Karen, the board. All of it. Do you understand why it mattered?" She nodded. "It wasn't just about a right of way. It was about memory. About standing still while everything else rushes to pave over what made us." She took a deep breath. "I want to do something," she said. "For Grandma. For you, for this place, What kind of something? I want to start a conservation project, maybe a foundation. Protect local easements. Educate neighborhoods about legacy lands. Help kids learn to listen to places, not just own them." I stared at her for a long moment, heart caught somewhere between pride and grief. Evelyn would have wept. But I just smiled and said, "Then let's build it together." The Turner Legacy Trust was established 6 months later. It started small, a few grants, a few school visits, a modest scholarship named in Evelyn's honor. But word spread. Lawyers, planners, teachers, even developers reached out. They wanted to learn how to avoid HOA overreach, how to protect history, how to make space for stories in their streets. Clara handled the legal side. Lily led community outreach. Michael built the digital archive. And I kept fishing. On the 1-year anniversary of the board's vote, Pinebrook held a community celebration at the lake. Not a forced HOA gathering, a real one. Potluck tables, lanterns in the trees, children in bare feet racing through the grass. Roger gave a short speech. Clara followed reading from Evelyn's old journal. And then, to my great surprise, they asked me to say a few words. I stepped to the edge of the dock, cane in hand, wind brushing my cheek. I was never one for speeches. I began voice low. But I've come to learn that sometimes the quietest people have the most to protect. I looked out at the crowd. At first, I fought for a path. Then for my wife's memory. And finally, I realized I was fighting for all of us. For the right to remember who we were before fences, before fines, before fear. I paused. This trail, this lake, it doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to anyone who walks it with respect, with care, with heart. And if we keep listening, if we keep rooted, then maybe, just maybe, we'll remember how to be neighbors again. Applause came gently, then built like rain on a rooftop. Lily released a small paper boat onto the water. On its side she'd written, "The lake remembers." And I knew then. Legacy wasn't about plaques or papers. It was about presence. About walking the same trail again and again, not because you're stuck, but because it leads you home. That night, after the music faded and the lanterns dimmed, I sat alone by the water. The stars reflected on the surface like distant campfires. The wind lifted Evelyn's blue scarf, still tied gently to the porch post, and carried its ghost of jasmine and lavender to the edge of the dock. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was remembering her. I felt like she was remembering me.